Wyoming Territory, 1875. The unforgiving frontier stretched like an endless canvas of brutal beauty, where survival demanded every ounce of grit a man possessed. Owen Anderson tightened his grip on the reins as his horse picked its way through the rugged terrain of the Laramie Range. At 25, he'd already spent 7 hard years working cattle, his youth hardened into the lean muscle and weathered resolve of a seasoned rider. His Stetson cast a shadow over piercing blue eyes that rarely softened for anything or anyone. No room for sentiment out here, his first trail boss had told him. Cowboys love their horses, their whiskey, and their freedom in that order. Anything else gets you killed. It was a truth Owen had seen proven time and again. The men who pined for sweethearts back east were distracted, made mistakes. The married hands eventually drifted away from the drive, seeking steadier work to support families. Even the toughest cowpunchers grew soft when love entered the equation. Owen had vowed never to be one of them. The distant smoke of civilization pulled his attention as the small settlement of Pine Creek appeared on the horizon. Thunderclouds gathered behind him, promising the first real storm of spring. His provisions were running low, and with 2 days' ride still ahead to reach the Double T Ranch where he'd hired on for the season, Owen reluctantly steered toward town. The false-fronted buildings of Pine Creek's Main Street were a far cry from the sprawling ranches and open ranges where Owen felt most at home. He'd stop only long enough to replenish supplies and perhaps catch a hot meal before continuing on. Anything more was a luxury cowboys like him couldn't afford. Pine Creek's general store sat wedged between the town's only saloon and a newly constructed schoolhouse. Owen dismounted, securing his chestnut gelding to the hitching post with practiced efficiency. His worn boots kicked up dust as he climbed the wooden steps. The store's bell announced his arrival, but the shopkeeper remained engrossed in conversation with the only other customer, a young woman whose back was turned to the door. Her dress was a simple calico in deep blue, tailored to reveal the graceful curve of her waist. Thick auburn hair cascaded down her back in loose waves, captured at the nape by a modest ribbon. "I simply cannot accept credit any longer, Miss Davis," the shopkeeper was saying, his tone apologetic but firm. "With your father's debts mounting, I must insist on payment." "Mr. Holbrook, please, the children need proper supplies," the woman replied, her voice steady despite the obvious distress in her posture. "Once the spring planting yields. Your father made the same promises last harvest and the one before." Owen shifted uncomfortably. Private business wasn't his concern. He moved toward the shelves of canned goods, intent on gathering his supplies and departing. The woman turned then, and Owen found himself arrested by the most striking pair of hazel eyes he'd ever encountered. They were proud eyes, stubborn even, set in a face of undeniable beauty. She couldn't have been more than 20, yet her expression carried the weight of responsibilities beyond her years. "Pardon me," she said, noticing his stare. Owen quickly averted his gaze, unaccustomed to being caught in such indiscretions. "Ma'am," he responded with a curt nod, reaching for a can of beans. The shopkeeper, sensing an escape from the uncomfortable exchange, turned his attention to Owen. "Help you find something, cowboy?" "Just passing through. Need provisions for a couple days' ride." The woman gathered her empty basket and moved toward the door. Owen couldn't help but notice the fine tremble in her hands as she adjusted her shawl. Despite his determination to remain uninvolved, he found himself speaking before thought caught up. "Add whatever the lady needs to my purchase." The words hung in the air, surprising all 3 of them. The woman's eyes widened, a flash of indignation crossing her features. "I don't accept charity from strangers," she said. "Not charity," Owen replied, suddenly self-conscious under her scrutiny. "Just helping a neighbor. Way of the West, isn't it?" "We're hardly neighbors, Mr. Anderson." "Owen Anderson." "Mr. Anderson," she straightened, pride evident in every line of her body. "I'm quite capable of managing my affairs without the intervention of passing cowboys." With that, she exited the store, the bell jingling in her wake. The shopkeeper sighed, shaking his head. "That's Victoria Davis, stubborn as they come, just like her father, been trying to keep that homestead alive since Thomas took ill last winter. Owen frowned. A young woman managing a homestead alone was practically unheard of, especially in territory this harsh. Illness, he asked despite himself. Consumption. Doc gives him till summer's end if he's lucky. The shopkeeper began totaling Owen's purchases. Shame about the girl, 22 years old and likely to lose everything once he's gone. No brothers, no uncles, just her and those 3 orphaned children they took in. Owen paid for his supplies, his mind unexpectedly preoccupied with the woman's predicament. It wasn't his concern. He had his own path, his own responsibilities. Getting tangled in someone else's troubles was exactly the sort of complication that could derail a cowboy's life. Yet as the first drops of rain began to fall, Owen found himself hesitating on the store's porch, watching Victoria Davis struggle to secure her empty baskets to a weather-worn wagon. The skies opened without warning, and the downpour was immediate and merciless. "Damn it all," he muttered, pulling his hat lower and stepping into the rain. Victoria was frantically trying to cover the wagon bed with a tarp when Owen approached. Without a word, he took the corner she was wrestling with and secured it efficiently to the wagon frame. "I didn't ask for your help," she said, rainwater streaming down her face. "Didn't offer it," Owen replied, continuing his work. "Just doing what needs doing." They worked in silence until the wagon was secured. By then, both were thoroughly soaked. Victoria climbed onto the driver's seat, gathering the reins of an ancient mule that had seen better days. "Thank you," she conceded finally, though her expression remained guarded. Owen nodded, stepping back from the wagon. "That storm's getting worse. How far to your place?" 4 miles east, along Willow Creek. 4 miles in this downpour would be miserable, possibly dangerous if the creek was rising. Owen glanced at his own horse, then back at Victoria. "Miss Davis, I don't mean to presume, but—" "Then don't," she interrupted, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "I've managed worse weather than this, Mr. Anderson." Before he could respond, she snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward into the rain-soaked street. Owen watched her go, telling himself it was for the best. He had his own journey to resume, his own future waiting at the Double T, yet something about Victoria Davis had lodged itself in his thoughts like a burr under a saddle blanket. Her determination, her pride. The burden she carried alone. The rational part of Owen's mind, the part that had kept him alive in unforgiving territory, urged him to mount up and ride west, away from Pine Creek and its stubborn homesteader with the auburn hair. But as lightning split the sky and thunder followed with a crack that spooked even his steady gelding, Owen found himself making the kind of decision cowboys were warned against. He mounted and turned east, following the wagon tracks already being washed away by the relentless rain. The storm intensified as Owen tracked the wagon along the sodden trail. Visibility decreased until he could barely see 20 yards ahead, but the wheel ruts remained distinct enough to follow. After riding for nearly 2 miles, he spotted the wagon tilted precariously at the edge of what should have been a small creek crossing. Willow Creek had transformed into a churning torrent, swollen with spring runoff and the sudden deluge. The wagon's right wheel had slipped into a washout, and Victoria was desperately trying to calm the panicked mule while keeping the vehicle from sliding further into the current. Owen spurred his gelding forward, splashing through the muddy approach. "Miss Davis," he called over the storm's roar. Victoria's head whipped around, her soaked hair plastered to her face. Relief flickered across her features before pride reasserted itself. "The creek's never been this high," she shouted back. "The crossing washed out." Owen dismounted, assessing the situation. The wagon wasn't yet in immediate danger, but the continuing rain would make the embankment increasingly unstable. "We need to unhitch the mule and secure the wagon," he called, leading his horse to higher ground. Working together, they managed to free the frightened animal. Owen tethered both the mule and his horse to a sturdy cottonwood before returning to help Victoria retrieve what few supplies she had in the wagon. "My homestead's just beyond that rise," Victoria said, pointing across the swollen creek. "We can't cross here. We'll have to go upstream to the Larson Bridge." "How far?" 2 miles, but in this weather. Owen nodded grimly. The storm showed no signs of abating and daylight was waning. We'll need shelter for the night, anywhere nearby. Victoria hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the implications. There's an old line shack about a half-mile back. The Henderson outfit uses it during roundup. That's our best option, Owen decided. We'll collect your wagon tomorrow when the creek subsides. The abandoned line shack was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was dry and sturdy enough to weather the storm. A small fireplace dominated one wall, and the sparse furnishings consisted of a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot. Owen busied himself starting a fire while Victoria stood awkwardly near the door, her arms wrapped around herself as water pooled at her feet. "You should get out of those wet clothes," Owen said matter-of-factly, keeping his back turned as he coaxed the flames higher. "I'll step outside." "And stand in the rain?" Victoria asked, a hint of wry humor breaking through her reserve. "That hardly seems sensible, Mr. Anderson." Owen remained focused on the fire. "I've slept in worse conditions, Miss Davis." "Victoria," she corrected softly. "If we're to be stranded together, you might as well use my name." Owen nodded, still not looking at her. "Owen, then." "There's a blanket in my bag," she said. "I can change behind it if you'll keep your attention on that fire." True to his word, Owen kept his back turned as Victoria changed into the only dry garment she had, a flannel nightdress packed for an overnight stay in town she'd planned later in the week. She draped her soaked clothing near the fire, careful to maintain a modest arrangement. "You can turn around now," she said when she was settled on one of the chairs, the blanket wrapped securely around her shoulders. Owen allowed himself a brief glance, noting the high color in her cheeks and the way the firelight caught in her damp hair, turning it to burnished gold. He quickly averted his eyes, removing his own sodden jacket and hanging it beside her clothing. "You mentioned orphans," he said, seeking neutral conversation as he settled into the remaining chair. "You've taken in children." Victoria's expression softened. 3 of them. Their parents were neighbors who died of fever last summer. "My father and I couldn't bear to see them sent to an orphanage in Cheyenne." "That's a significant responsibility." "They're good children. Mary's 12, the twins just 9. Her voice held unmistakable affection. "They're with my father now. I was in town trying to secure supplies for the school lessons I've been giving them." Owen found himself unexpectedly moved by her dedication. "You're teaching them yourself." "Someone must. The nearest school is too far, especially with my father unable to manage the homestead alone." Victoria studied him across the small space. "What about you, Owen? What brings a cowboy out alone this time of year?" "Hired on with the double T for the season. Was supposed to arrive tomorrow." "They'll hold your position," Victoria assured him. "Thaddeus Tucker is a fair man. He's purchased our vegetables in years past." The conversation flowed more easily than Owen expected, the cramped quarters and howling storm creating a strange intimacy between strangers. Victoria spoke of her childhood in Missouri, her family's journey west after the war, and the challenges of establishing their homestead. Owen found himself sharing more than he typically would, his years working cattle throughout the territories, the stillness of nights beneath vast prairie skies, the freedom of horizons unbounded by fences or obligations. "Yet you're bound for the double T," Victoria observed. "That suggests you're seeking something more permanent." Owen stared into the fire. "A man can't ride forever." "What will you do when the riding stops?" It was a question Owen had avoided asking himself, yet Victoria's direct gaze demanded an honest answer. "Every season I put away what I can," he admitted. "Someday maybe a small spread of my own, nothing ambitious." "Just a piece of earth to call your own," Victoria finished for him. "Isn't that what we all want in the end?" Their eyes met across the flickering light, and Owen felt something shift in the space between them, something dangerous and compelling. He stood abruptly, moving to add another log to the fire. "You should take the cot," he said, changing the subject. "I'll manage fine on the floor." Victoria didn't argue, the day's events having clearly taken their toll. As she settled beneath the blanket, Owen spread his damp bedroll near the fire and stretched out, using his saddle as a pillow. "Owen," Victoria's voice came softly through the darkness. "Yes. Thank you for following, for helping." Owen closed his eyes, uncomfortably aware of the unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. "Get some sleep, Victoria." The storm passed during the night, leaving behind a washed-clean world glittering with morning sunlight. Owen woke at dawn, finding Victoria already dressed in her still-damp clothing and rekindling the fire. "The creek should have receded enough to retrieve your wagon," he said after a simple breakfast of coffee and jerky from his provisions. They rode double on Owen's gelding, Victoria seated behind him with her arms loosely circling his waist. The physical proximity was unsettling, her presence at his back both foreign and somehow right. Owen kept his focus rigidly on the trail ahead, trying to ignore the subtle scent of her hair or the way her hands occasionally tightened when they navigated uneven terrain. The creek had indeed subsided, though the crossing remained treacherous. Together they managed to free the wagon from the mud and secure it on solid ground. Victoria's relief was palpable. "I can make it home from here," she said once the mule was rehitched. "You've delayed your journey to the Double T long enough." Owen knew she was right. He'd already lost valuable time and Thaddeus Tucker, while Fair expected punctuality from his hands. Yet the thought of simply riding away left him strangely hollow. "I'll see you safely home," he found himself saying. "Make sure those children and your father are all right after the storm." Victoria studied him for a moment, then nodded. "As you wish." The Davis homestead was modest but well-maintained, a testament to stubborn perseverance against frontier hardship. A small cabin with a stone chimney anchored the property, flanked by a barn, chicken coop, and fenced garden plot. 3 young children burst from the cabin as the wagon approached, their excited voices carrying across the yard. Miss Victoria, did you bring books?" The oldest girl, presumably Mary, ran alongside the wagon, her face alight with anticipation. "We thought you got washed away," one of the twins exclaimed. "The creek turned into a river," added the other. Victoria laughed, the sound transforming her face in a way that caught at something in Owen's chest. "I'm perfectly fine, thanks to Mr. Anderson here." The children's attention immediately shifted to Owen, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and awe. "Are you a real cowboy?" one twin asked. "Do you have a gun?" questioned the other. "Samuel Joseph, mind your manners," Victoria chided gently. "Mr. Anderson is our guest." Owen dismounted, suddenly self-conscious under the children's scrutiny. "I'm just passing through," he explained, helping Victoria down from the wagon. "Father's been worried sick," Mary informed Victoria, her serious eyes belying her young age. "He tried to go looking for you, but his coughing got bad." Concern flashed across Victoria's face. "I'll go to him now." "Mary, would you show Mr. Anderson where he can water his horse?" The girl nodded solemnly, gesturing for Owen to follow her to the well. The twins trailed behind, peppering him with questions about cowboys and horses that Owen answered with increasing ease, surprised by how naturally he interacted with the children. Thomas Davis was seated in a rocking chair on the cabin's small porch when Owen returned from the well. Despite his evident illness, the gaunt face and labored breathing, the older man's eyes were sharp with intelligence and paternal concern as he observed Owen's approach. "So you're the cowboy who saved my daughter," Thomas called, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested. Owen removed his hat respectfully. "Just happened to be traveling the same road, sir." "Victoria says you're bound for the Double T," Thomas gestured to the chair beside him. "Sit a spell before you ride on." The invitation was delivered as a subtle command, one father to a younger man. Owen complied, settling onto the porch chair while the children scampered off to help Victoria unload the wagon. "My daughter is the most precious thing in this world to me, Mr. Anderson," Thomas said without preamble. "Since her mother passed bringing her into this world, it's been just the 2 of us against everything this territory could throw our way." "She's very capable," Owen offered. Thomas nodded, a mixture of pride and sorrow in his rheumy eyes, too capable sometimes, shouldering burdens no young woman should have to carry. He paused, a coughing spell overtaking him momentarily. I won't see another winter, Mr. Anderson, the doctor's been plain about that. Owen shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I don't think. What will happen to her, to those children? Thomas continued, his gaze intense despite his weakened state. This land requires a man's strength to work it properly. Victoria's too proud to marry out of necessity, but without a husband, the claim will be vulnerable once I'm gone. Surely there are neighbors. Neighbors with their own struggles, their own mouths to feed. Thomas shook his head. I've watched you with those children. You've got a decent way about you, and the way you look at my daughter when you think no one notices. Mr. Davis, Owen interrupted, standing abruptly. I've only known your daughter since yesterday. I'm a cowhand, not a homesteader. Whatever you're suggesting isn't possible. Thomas studied him for a long moment. A man makes his own possibilities in this country, son. Remember that. Victoria emerged from the cabin then, carrying a plate with freshly baked biscuits and a jar of preserves. Father, are you badgering our guest? She asked lightly, though her eyes reflected concern. Just getting acquainted, Thomas replied innocently. Mr. Anderson was about to tell me about the double T operation. The conversation shifted to safer territory, cattle prices, weather predictions for the coming summer, local news from Pine Creek. Owen found himself relaxing despite his initial discomfort, drawn into the warm dynamic of the Davis household. The children's chatter, Victoria's quiet competence as she attended to her father while managing the meal preparation, even Thomas's sharp observations about territory politics. It all created an atmosphere Owen had experienced only fleetingly in his nomadic existence. When the simple midday meal concluded, Owen knew he could delay no longer. The double T was still a day's ride away, and he'd already tested the limits of what could be considered acceptable tardiness. I should get on my way, he announced, standing to collect his hat. Victoria walked him to where his horse was tethered. The children had disappeared into the barn for afternoon chores, and Thomas had retired inside to rest, leaving them momentarily alone. I can't thank you enough, Victoria said, her usual composure softened by genuine gratitude. Not just for yesterday, but for being kind to Father. He doesn't get much company these days. He's worried about your future, Owen said before he could think better of it. Victoria's expression clouded. Father sees shadows where I see possibilities. This homestead is everything to me. I won't lose it with or without a husband. I didn't mean to suggest. No, she interrupted, offering a small smile. I know you didn't, but I'm not blind to the reality, Owen. When Father passes, there will be men from town ready to claim this land believes a woman can't handle. They're wrong. Owen believed her. In the brief time he'd known Victoria Davis, he'd recognized a strength that many men he'd ridden with lacked, not just physical endurance, but a resilience of spirit that the frontier demanded but rarely received. If you ever need anything, he found himself saying, the double T isn't far. Cowboys aren't known for settling in one place, Victoria observed, studying him with those direct hazel eyes. Maybe some cowboys find reasons to stay, Owen replied, surprised by his own words. A flush of color touched Victoria's cheeks. Safe travels, Owen Anderson. He mounted his horse, tipping his hat in farewell. As he rode away, Owen fought the urge to look back, knowing that if he did, the image of Victoria Davis standing in the homestead yard might burn itself too deeply into his memory. Cowboys were not meant to put down roots. They followed the seasons, the cattle, the next job. They valued their freedom above all else and left behind nothing that couldn't fit in a saddlebag. That was the code Owen had lived by for 7 years, the wisdom passed from seasoned hands to greenhornish boys around countless campfires. Yet as he rode toward the double T, Owen found himself calculating the distance between the ranch and the Davis homestead. Just a half-day's ride if a man pushed his horse. The Double T Ranch sprawled across nearly 20,000 acres of prime Wyoming grassland. Thaddeus Tucker had established his operation 15 years earlier, building it into one of the most respected cattle outfits in the territory. The main house stood on a gentle rise overlooking corrals, bunkhouses, and outbuildings that hummed with the activity of a well-run operation. Owen reported to the foreman, a weathered man named Silas who accepted his explanation for the delay with minimal comment. By sunset, Owen had settled into the bunkhouse, unpacked his meager belongings, and begun acquainting himself with the other hands. The routine of ranch life quickly reasserted itself: pre-dawn breakfasts, long days in the saddle, evenings of cards or conversation before exhausted sleep. Yet something had changed. Owen found his thoughts repeatedly drifting eastward toward a modest homestead and its auburn-haired defender. He volunteered for supply runs to Pine Creek, hoping for glimpses of Victoria when she came to town. Twice their paths crossed, brief encounters filled with polite conversation that revealed nothing of the connection he'd felt in that lined shack during the storm. Spring melted into summer. The first cattle drive of the season took Owen and the other double T hands north for 3 weeks. Upon his return, he learned from Pine Creek's gossiping shopkeeper that Thomas Davis's health had taken a significant turn for the worse. "Sheriff's been out there twice already," the man reported, wrapping Owen's purchases. "Seems Harlan Fletcher's making noise about filing a claim on the Davis place once the old man passes. Says a woman and 3 orphans can't possibly work that land properly." "Fletcher's got no right," Owen said, his voice sharper than intended. The shopkeeper raised his eyebrows. "Territory's full of men with no rights taking what they want, Anderson. You've been riding long enough to know that." That evening, Owen requested Sunday off from Silas, claiming personal business in Pine Creek. The foreman granted it without question. Owen had proven himself a reliable hand, never shirking duties or causing trouble among the men. The Davis homestead appeared unchanged when Owen arrived early Sunday morning, though subtle signs of struggle were visible to his experienced eye: untended fence sections, garden rows with encroaching weeds, a barn door hanging slightly askew. Victoria emerged from the cabin at the sound of his approach, surprise registering briefly before her features composed themselves. "Owen," she greeted him, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "This is unexpected." "Thought I'd see how you and your father are getting on," he replied, dismounting. Victoria's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Father has good days and difficult ones. Today is challenging. I heard in town that Harlan Fletcher's been causing trouble." A flash of anger crossed Victoria's face. "Fletcher believes this homestead should be his because his claim adjoins ours to the north. He offered to buy us out last year, and Father refused. And now he's circling," Owen concluded grimly. Victoria straightened her shoulders. "He can circle all he wants. This land is ours, properly filed and worked for 5 years. Even without Father, I intend to keep it that way." "You can't fight off a determined man alone, Victoria." "I'm not alone," she countered, gesturing toward the cabin where the children could be heard reciting lessons. "And I'm not without resources. Father taught me to shoot, and our neighbors the Hendersons have promised help with the heavy work come harvest time." Owen wanted to argue further, but recognized the stubborn set of Victoria's jaw. Instead, he gestured to his saddlebags. "I brought some things from the double T coffee, sugar. Cook sent along some of his sourdough starter, said any decent household should have its own." Victoria's defenses softened visibly. "That's very thoughtful. Would you like to come in? The children would be glad to see you." The small cabin was neat but cramped, with Thomas's bed moved to the main room where Victoria could attend him more easily. The older man was propped up with pillows, listening as Mary led the twins through reading exercises. His face brightened at Owen's entrance, though the effort of greeting triggered a coughing spell that left him breathless. "Anderson," he finally managed, "come to check on your investment." "Father," Victoria admonished, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Just being neighborly," Owen replied, nodding respectfully to Thomas before turning his attention to the children. "You 3 look like you've grown a foot since I saw you last." The twins abandoned their lessons to show Owen their latest accomplishments: a whittled horse, a sampler with carefully stitched letters, a collection of interesting rocks. Mary, more reserved than her brothers but equally eager for adult approval, proudly displayed the account books she'd been keeping for the homestead. "Miss Victoria says I have a head for figures," she explained earnestly. "I'm tracking all the eggs and vegetables, so we know exactly what we can sell in town." Owen examined the carefully written columns with genuine admiration. Very impressive. The Double T could use a bookkeeper this meticulous. The morning passed in comfortable domesticity. Owen found himself helping with chores, mending the barn door, reinforcing a chicken coop, clearing an irrigation channel that had become clogged with debris. Victoria worked alongside him, her capable hands and practical knowledge a reminder that she was no delicate flower in need of rescuing. When the midday meal was ready, Victoria called everyone to the table. Thomas insisted on joining them, though the effort of moving from bed to chair left him trembling. The meal was simple: beans, cornbread, and a small portion of salt pork, but served with such care that Owen found himself more satisfied than after the heartiest bunkhouse spread. As the children cleared the dishes, Thomas fixed Owen with a penetrating stare. "Fletcher came by yesterday," he said without preamble. "Brought the sheriff, claiming we've let the boundary markers fall into disrepair. It's nonsense, an excuse to encroach on our water access." "What did the sheriff say?" Owen asked. "Said he couldn't interfere in a property dispute unless there was evidence of actual trespassing or damage." Thomas's thin hand curled into a fist on the table. "Fletcher's just waiting for me to die. Then he'll move in, claiming Victoria can't maintain the full acreage." "I've told you, Father, I won't let that happen," Victoria interjected, her voice tight. "And I've told you, girl, the territory won't recognize a woman's claim without a husband, not when there's a man challenging it." Thomas turned back to Owen. "That's the reality, Anderson, no matter how unfair." The tension in the small cabin was palpable. Owen could see the toll it was taking on Victoria, the proud set of her shoulders belied by the shadows beneath her eyes, the slight tremble in her hands as she poured more coffee. "What if someone else worked the land?" Owen suggested carefully. "As a hired hand, not an owner, just until Victoria establishes her right beyond question." "No hired hand would work for what we could pay," Victoria said. "And I won't accept charity." "Not charity," Owen countered. "An arrangement. I've been setting aside most of my Double T wages. I could invest in the homestead, take a share of the harvest instead of wages." Thomas's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "A partnership, you mean?" "Temporary," Owen clarified, not daring to look directly at Victoria. "Just until the Fletcher situation resolves." "And the Double T would spare you for this arrangement?" Victoria asked, skepticism evident in her tone. "I'd keep my bunk there, ride out here when I'm not on duty." Owen found himself warming to the idea as he spoke. "The busiest season at the Double T is almost over. Silas would likely agree to a reduced schedule." Thomas and Victoria exchanged a long look, years of understanding passing between them without words. "It's worth considering," Thomas finally said, his voice gentle but firm. "We can discuss the details after Sunday dinner." The afternoon brought more visitors. The Henderson family from the neighboring homestead arrived bearing a freshly baked pie and news from further afield. The atmosphere lightened as the small cabin filled with conversation and laughter. Owen found himself drawn into the community's rhythms, offering opinions on cattle prices and weather predictions, swapping stories with Jacob Henderson about their shared experiences on cattle drives. Throughout it all, Owen was acutely aware of Victoria moving through the room, serving food, tending to her father, guiding the children's interactions with gentle authority. Several times he caught her watching him, her expression unreadable before she quickly turned away. As dusk approached, the Hendersons took their leave. The children were sent to prepare for bed, and Thomas, exhausted by the day's socialization, allowed Victoria to help him back to his bed. When Victoria returned to the main room, she found Owen standing by the door, hat in hand. "I should get back to the Double T," he said, suddenly uncertain of his welcome. "Silas expects all hands present for Monday morning assignments." Victoria nodded, though she made no move to open the door. Your proposal earlier about working the homestead, was it sincere? Of course, Owen replied, surprised by the question. Why? The directness of her gaze demanded honesty. You hardly know us, Owen. Cowboys don't typically seek out additional responsibilities, especially not ones tied to land. The question pierced through Owen's careful facade. Why indeed? The sensible part of him recognized the madness of what he was offering, dividing his loyalties, risking his position at the Double T, potentially antagonizing a local landowner like Fletcher. It contradicted everything he'd learned about survival in the territories, yet the answer came with unexpected clarity. Because since that night in the line shack, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you, he admitted. About your courage, your determination, about the life you're building here. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. Owen. I know it's foolish, he continued, the words coming faster now that he'd started. I know cowboys aren't supposed to form attachments. That's the first lesson any trail boss teaches. But meeting you has made me question whether that's wisdom or just fear dressed up as common sense. You don't know what you're saying, Victoria whispered, though she took a half step closer. This life, it's struggle and sacrifice every day, nothing like the freedom of the trail. Maybe true freedom isn't about having no ties, Owen said, surprising himself with the thought. Maybe it's about choosing your ties carefully. The space between them seemed to contract, the small cabin suddenly intimate in the gathering darkness. Victoria's face was illuminated by the soft glow of the oil lamp, her expression a complex mixture of hope and hesitation. I can't offer you anything beyond partnership in the work, she said finally. My first responsibility is to father and the children. I'm not asking for more, Owen assured her, though part of him recognized the lie in his words. Just the chance to help. Victoria studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, decisively. Sunday afternoons, then. When you're free from the Double T, we'll try your arrangement and see if it benefits us both. It wasn't everything Owen suddenly found himself wanting, but it was a beginning, a tether between his life and hers that hadn't existed before. He extended his hand to seal their agreement, and Victoria's fingers clasped his briefly, warm and strong. Until next Sunday, Owen said, settling his hat on his head and stepping out into the night. The rhythm of Owen's life shifted over the subsequent weeks. His days at the Double T remained filled with the familiar work of cattle management, fence repair, and the 100 other tasks that kept a ranch functioning. But his focus had changed. Each chore completed, each dollar earned, now had purpose beyond mere survival. Sundays became the pivot around which his week revolved. Silas, after initial skepticism, granted Owen regular leave once he demonstrated that his Double T responsibilities wouldn't suffer. The aging foreman seemed to recognize something in Owen's determination that warranted accommodation rather than resistance. At the Davis homestead, Owen's contributions quickly proved valuable. His strength and knowledge complemented Victoria's careful management of their limited resources. Together they repaired outbuildings, expanded the garden plot, and reinforced boundary markers against Fletcher's encroachment. The children flourished under the additional adult attention, particularly the twins, who trailed Owen constantly, absorbing his lessons about horses and cattle with solemn concentration. Thomas watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and urgency. His condition deteriorated as summer progressed, each day stealing more of his strength. During lucid moments, he offered guidance about the homestead's operation, where the best water lay, which fields drained poorly in spring, how to predict early frosts from the behavior of local wildlife. You're a quick study, Anderson, he remarked one afternoon as Owen described his plans for reinforcing the root cellar before winter. For a man who spent his life avoiding anything resembling permanence. Owen smiled ruefully. Maybe I was avoiding the wrong things. Victoria trusts you, Thomas said, his directness undiminished by illness. I see it in how she speaks of you when you're not here, in how she plans around your visits. I respect her vision for this place, Owen replied carefully. And her commitment to the children. Thomas fixed him with a knowing look. Respect is a fine foundation, but it's not the whole structure, is it? Before Owen could formulate a response, Victoria entered with Thomas's medicine, effectively ending the conversation. But the older man's words lingered, forcing Owen to confront the shifting nature of his feelings toward Victoria Davis. What had begun as admiration for her courage had deepened into something more complex, an awareness of her quiet humor, her practical intelligence, the grace with which she balanced strength and tenderness. He found himself cataloging small details. The particular way she tucked stray hairs behind her ear when concentrating, how she hummed old hymns while working in the garden, the patient tone she used when explaining difficult concepts to the children. Yet Owen maintained a careful distance. Victoria had made her priorities clear, and he respected the boundaries she'd established. Their partnership remained focused on the practical work of the homestead, their conversations centered on planning and problem-solving rather than personal matters. Until the night Thomas Davis died. It happened on a Wednesday in late August, with the first hint of autumn crispness in the evening air. Owen received word at the Double T through Jacob Henderson, who'd ridden out at Victoria's request. "She asked for you specifically," Henderson explained, his weathered face solemn. "Said you'd want to know right away." Silas granted Owen immediate leave, no questions asked. The ride to the Davis homestead passed in a blur of concern and sorrow. Owen had come to respect Thomas deeply over the summer months, recognizing in the older man a steadfastness that matched his daughter's. The homestead was quiet when Owen arrived, lantern light glowing softly from the cabin windows. Mary met him at the door, her young face composed despite the redness around her eyes. "Miss Victoria's with the preacher," she explained solemnly, leading Owen inside. "They're making arrangements." The small main room had been transformed. Thomas lay on his bed, peaceful in death, cleaned and dressed in his Sunday best. The local minister stood near the hearth, speaking quietly with Victoria, whose straight back and lifted chin belied the devastation Owen could see in her eyes. "Owen," she acknowledged his arrival with a small nod. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," he replied, removing his hat respectfully. "I'm so sorry, Victoria." The minister, a kindly man named Reverend Graham, excused himself tactfully to check on the twins. When he'd gone, Victoria's composure wavered slightly. "He went easily," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just stopped breathing while I read to him. The doctor says there was no suffering at the end." Owen stepped closer, uncertain what comfort he could offer. "Your father was a good man, one of the finest I've known. He worried so about leaving us vulnerable," Victoria continued, her gaze moving to her father's still form. "About Fletcher and the claim and my future." "You're not alone," Owen said firmly. "The Hendersons, Reverend Graham, the Double T, you have allies." Victoria looked up at him then, her hazel eyes swimming with unshed tears. "And you? Are you an ally, Owen Anderson?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Owen recognized the vulnerability it represented, coming from a woman who prided herself on self-sufficiency. "I'm whatever you need me to be," he answered truthfully. The funeral took place 2 days later in the small churchyard of Pine Creek. The turnout surprised Owen. Dozens of homesteaders and townspeople gathered to pay their respects, a testament to Thomas Davis's standing in the community. Even Thaddeus Tucker himself attended, offering Victoria his condolences and assurances that the Double T would continue purchasing her produce. Harlan Fletcher was conspicuously absent, though his foreman observed the proceedings from a distance, his presence a silent reminder of the challenges ahead. The days following the funeral established a new pattern. Owen arranged with Silas to work 3 days at the Double T, spending the remainder of each week at the Davis homestead. He moved his few possessions into the small lean-to attached to the barn, adamant that Victoria and the children maintain their privacy despite his increased presence. The arrangement raised eyebrows in Pine Creek, but Victoria's reputation and Owen's growing integration into the community forestalled the worst of the gossip. Reverend Graham made a point of visiting regularly, his presence lending respectability to the unconventional household. September brought harvest time, with its exhausting schedule of gathering, preserving, and preparing for winter. Owen and Victoria worked side by side from dawn until dusk, their partnership deepening through shared labor. The children thrived under the structure Victoria maintained: lessons in the morning, chores in the afternoon, stories by the fire each evening. Yet beneath the surface of this hard-won stability lurked the shadow of Harlan Fletcher's ambitions. Reports filtered back from town of his boasts that the Davis girl wouldn't last the winter without a proper man to work the claim. "He's filed a formal challenge with the land office in Cheyenne," Jacob Henderson reported during one Sunday dinner. "Claims your father's improvements weren't substantial enough to satisfy homestead requirements." Victoria's hand tightened on her fork. "That's absurd. Father built every structure on this property with his own hands. We've cultivated 20 acres consistently for 5 years. Fletcher's got friends in the territorial government," Henderson replied grimly. "And money to grease whatever palms need greasing." After their guests departed, Victoria paced the cabin restlessly, frustration evident in every movement. "It's so unjust," she fumed. "Everything Father worked for, everything we've built, at the mercy of a man like Fletcher." Owen watched her from his seat by the fire, understanding her anger. "The land office will send someone to inspect the property before making any decision. When they do, they'll see the truth." "Unless Fletcher bribes them too," Victoria countered, "or worse, interferes with the homestead itself." The possibility hung between them, unspoken but acknowledged. Fletcher's reputation for ruthlessness was well established. Other small landowners had faced mysterious misfortunes when they stood in his way: barns that caught fire, cattle that disappeared, wells that suddenly went dry. "I won't let that happen," Owen said, rising to stand before Victoria, halting her pacing. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Victoria looked up at him, searching his face. "Why, Owen? Why have you tied yourself to our struggles when you could ride away free?" The question had hovered unasked between them for months. Now, in the soft lamplight of the cabin, with the children asleep and the night pressing close around them, Owen found the courage to answer truthfully. "Because I love you, Victoria Davis." The words, once spoken, seemed to alter the very air around them. Victoria's eyes widened, a flush spreading across her cheeks. "You can't," she whispered. "I do," Owen replied simply. "I think I have since that storm, maybe even since the moment you stood so proudly in that general store. I've tried not to. God knows I've reminded myself of every reason cowboys aren't supposed to love. But here we are." Victoria took a shaky breath. "Owen, I have 3 children depending on me, a homestead in jeopardy I can't think about." "I'm not asking you to change anything," he interrupted gently. "I'm just answering your question. I'm here because this is where I want to be, with you, with the children, fighting for what matters." The silence that followed was charged with possibility. Victoria stood so close that Owen could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, could detect the slight tremble in her lips as she considered his words. "I don't know what to say," she finally admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Owen assured her. "Nothing needs to change tonight." Victoria nodded slowly, then reached out to touch his hand. A brief, gentle contact that communicated more than words could have. "Good night, Owen," she said softly, before turning toward her room. Owen remained by the fire long after she'd gone, watching the embers die while contemplating the irrevocable step he'd taken. The code of the cowboy life he'd embraced for so long warned against exactly this vulnerability. Attachment meant weakness, love meant compromise, roots meant the end of freedom. Yet as he considered the alternative, riding away from Victoria and the children, returning to the isolated existence he'd once prized, Owen found no appeal in that freedom. Somehow, without his noticing, his definition of what mattered had fundamentally shifted. The first snow fell in early November, dusting the homestead with crystalline white that transformed the landscape. Owen woke in his linta to find the twins already outside, their excited voices carrying as they attempted to build a snowman with the meager accumulation. The day passed in comfortable domesticity, banking the cabin against the cold, checking livestock, preparing the hearty stew that would serve as their evening meal. Victoria seemed lighter somehow, her movements more relaxed as she worked alongside Owen. Several times he caught her watching him with a thoughtful expression that kindled hope in his chest. After the children were abed, Victoria brought 2 cups of coffee to the fire where Owen sat mending harness straps. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began without preamble, "about your feelings." Owen set aside his work, giving her his full attention, and Victoria's fingers tightened around her cup. "My whole life I've defined myself by my responsibilities: daughter, caretaker, teacher. Even with father gone, those duties haven't diminished. The children need stability. The homestead requires constant attention." "I know," Owen said quietly. "I'd never ask you to set those aside." "Let me finish," Victoria requested, her voice gentle but firm. "What I've realized is that fulfilling those duties doesn't mean denying myself happiness, or connection," she met his gaze directly, "or love." Owen's heart quickened. "Victoria." "I love you too, Owen Anderson," she said, the words emerging with quiet certainty. "I think I have since you followed my wagon through that storm, though I was too afraid to acknowledge it. Afraid of depending on someone who might leave, as cowboys always do." "I'm not leaving," Owen promised, reaching for her hand. "Not unless you send me away." Victoria's fingers intertwined with his, warm and certain. "Then I should tell you I have no intention of sending you away. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever if I can help it." The admission hung between them, profound in its simplicity. Owen lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles. Victoria's breath caught audibly, her eyes darkening with an emotion that mirrored the heat building in his own chest. "Where do we go from here?" she whispered. "Wherever you're comfortable going," Owen replied. "I'm in no rush, Victoria, we have time." She smiled then, a rare full smile that transformed her face. "Perhaps not as much time as all that." Fletcher's challenge will be heard next month. The land inspector arrives next week, and the children have been dropping increasingly unsubtle hints about whether you might consider moving from the Linta to somewhere more permanent. Owen laughed softly. "They're observant." "They adore you," Victoria said simply, "as do I." The confession, stated so directly, broke the last of Owen's hesitation. He leaned forward slowly, giving Victoria every opportunity to withdraw, and gently pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepened as Victoria responded with surprising eagerness. Her free hand came up to touch his face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw with wondering exploration. When they finally separated, both were breathing unevenly. "That was," Victoria began, then stopped, a becoming blush coloring her cheeks. "Just the beginning," Owen finished for her. "If you'll have me." "I believe I just said I would," she replied, her practical nature reasserting itself even as her eyes sparkled with newfound joy. The land inspector arrived precisely on schedule, a dour government official named Wilcox whose pinched expression suggested perpetual dissatisfaction. Owen and Victoria had prepared meticulously, ensuring every aspect of the homestead presented its best face. The children had been coached to behave impeccably, the buildings were spotless, and records of improvements and harvests were organized for review. Wilcox conducted his inspection with methodical thoroughness, measuring fields, examining structures, and making copious notes without comment. When he finally spoke, his tone was bureaucratic but not unkind. "Miss Davis, who is currently working this claim with you." Victoria straightened. "I manage the homestead with assistance from Mr. Anderson and the children." "Mr. Anderson is employed by you." "We have a partnership arrangement," Victoria clarified. "He divides his time between here and the Double T Ranch." Wilcox's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see, and your relationship is—" The implication hung in the air, uncomfortably direct. Victoria's chin lifted defiantly. "Mr. Anderson is a trusted friend who has helped us through my father's illness and passing." Wilcox made another note. "Miss Davis, I must be frank. While your improvements to the property are indeed substantial, Mr. Fletcher's challenge raises legitimate questions about a single woman's ability to maintain such a claim without male support. The territory has certain expectations. Expectations that a woman can't think or work as effectively as a man, Victoria interrupted, her voice tight with controlled anger. My father and I built this homestead together, Mr. Wilcox. I've managed our finances, planned our crops, and educated 3 children while doing so. I don't make the regulations, Miss Davis, Wilcox replied, unmoved. I merely enforce them. Owen stepped forward. Mr. Wilcox, Victoria Davis has demonstrated more capability and determination than most men I've worked with across 5 territories. This homestead thrives because of her management, not despite it. Wilcox studied Owen for a moment. Your advocacy is noted, Mr. Anderson. However, my recommendation to the land office must be based on established precedent and regulation. He closed his notebook with finality. You'll receive the official decision by post within the month. After Wilcox departed, Victoria stood motionless in the yard, her expression a mixture of fury and despair. It's already decided, she said flatly. He'll recommend in Fletcher's favor. We don't know that, Owen countered, though he'd reached the same conclusion. And even if he does, there are appeals. Appeals cost money we don't have, Victoria interrupted. And time we can't spare with winter approaching. She turned to face Owen directly. This is exactly what Father feared. The law doesn't see me as capable, regardless of evidence. It sees only a woman without a husband. The word hung between them, charged with implication. Owen took a careful breath. Then perhaps we should give them a husband. Victoria's eyes widened. Owen. Marry me, Victoria, he said, the words emerging with surprising ease despite their magnitude. Not just to secure the claim, though that matters, but because I love you, because I want to build a life with you and the children. Because I can't imagine riding away from this place or from you. This isn't how I imagined a proposal, Victoria said, though a smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Owen dropped to one knee in the yard, taking her hand in his. Victoria Davis, you've shown me that a cowboy's heart can find home in one woman, in one place. Will you make me the happiest man in Wyoming Territory and become my wife? Victoria's composure finally broke, tears spilling down her cheeks as she nodded. Yes, Owen Anderson, I will marry you. The wedding took place the following Sunday, a simple ceremony in the Pine Creek Church with half the town in attendance. Reverend Graham officiated, beaming approval as Owen and Victoria exchanged vows. Mary stood proudly as Victoria's attendant, while the twins served as ring-bearers with solemn dignity. Harlan Fletcher's reaction to the news was swift and predictable. A formal protest was filed with the land office, claiming the marriage was merely a convenience to circumvent rightful challenge. But with Owen officially established as the male head of household, the legal standing of Fletcher's complaint weakened considerably. The final ruling arrived in December, delivered by a snow-dusted mail carrier who seemed unaware of the document's significance. Victoria's hands trembled as she broke the seal, scanning the official language with Owen at her shoulder. The Davis homestead claim is hereby confirmed and validated, she read aloud, her voice strengthening with each word. All challenges are dismissed as without merit. The celebration that evening filled the small cabin with joy. The children danced around the room, the Hendersons and other neighbors arrived with food and good wishes, and even Silas rode out from the Double T to offer gruff congratulations. Later, when guests had departed and the children slept soundly, Owen and Victoria stood on the porch, watching moonlight transform the snow-covered landscape. I never thought I'd find this, Owen admitted, his arm around Victoria's waist. A home, a family, a purpose beyond the next drive or the next season. Victoria leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. And I never thought I'd find a cowboy who would choose roots over wandering. The wisest trail boss I ever rode with told me something I didn't understand until I met you, Owen said, pulling her closer. He said cowboys aren't told not to love because love is wrong. They're told not to love because once they do, they'll never be satisfied with the trail again. Was he right? Victoria asked, tilting her face up to his. Owen smiled, thinking of the small cabin behind them, warm with life and possibility, of the children sleeping peacefully within, of the woman in his arms who had changed everything he thought he knew about freedom and belonging. He was right, Owen confirmed, lowering his lips to Victoria's, and I couldn't be happier about it.